Hi, everyone. This is Inside the Americas. Coming up, this week was marked by new congressional wrangling over two major spending bills in the U.S. We will pick apart just what is America's infamous debt ceiling. Then we'll look at that shock verdict for R. Kelly, the R&B superstar found guilty in a sex trafficking trial. And Peru may still have the world's highest number of deaths compared to its population, but little by little, tourists are starting to come back in. Well, the future of Joe Biden's domestic agenda was called into serious question this week with wrangling between conservative and progressive wings of the Democratic Party over the scope of two major spending bills. But looming over that has been the threat of a government shutdown as Republicans refuse to join the Democrats in raising the country's borrowing limit. Now, that's called the debt ceiling, and Washington reaches it and raises it regularly. But its continued existence allows the threat of America defaulting on its payment obligations to hang over the global economy. Brian Quinn takes a closer look now at the U.S. debt ceiling's history and significance.
It is imperative that Congress address the debt limit.
An economic time bomb whose fuse is constantly being reset. First introduced in 1917 to give the U.S. Treasury more leeway to issue bonds, the debt ceiling is a cap on the total amount that the federal government can borrow to pay its bills. Since America typically runs significant budget deficits, its debt is consistently rising. Interest alone on the U.S. national debt is set to hit $378 billion for 2021. Lifting the debt ceiling doesn't authorize or even facilitate new spending. It just allows the U.S. to continue borrowing to meet its current obligations.
Now, Mr. President.
Since 1960, Congress has moved the debt ceiling 78 times. But recent decades have seen increased partisan polarization and reduced cooperation. In 2006, Democrats voted against raising the ceiling, citing massive deficits caused by the Bush tax cuts and Middle East invasions, but they didn't filibuster. In August 2019, Congress, with bipartisan support, suspended the debt ceiling through July of 2021, after Republicans added trillions in new U.S. debt via the 2017 Trump tax cuts. This August, the ceiling was raised to $28.4 trillion, but the national debt currently stands at $28.43 trillion, meaning the Treasury has been using exceptional measures, shifting funds around to pay the bills. But those measures can't go on forever, and if the Treasury runs out of money, the consequences would be dire.
It's necessary to avert a catastrophic event for our economy.
Millions of Americans would stop receiving Social Security and Medicare benefits, troops and federal employees would stop receiving paychecks, and America would be unable to pay interest on its existing bonds. Such a debt default would be unprecedented, damaging the U.S.'s credit rating and the dollar's position as the main international reserve currency. Most countries don't have a debt limit, and the growing risk of default in recent years has prompted many to consider doing away with America's. But that itself would require a bipartisan act of Congress, and for now, the debt limit is caught up in short-term political maneuvering.
There was a shock verdict this week for R. Kelly. The R&B superstar was found guilty in a sex trafficking trial. The jury in New York reached that decision on their second day of deliberations. Kelly was convicted on all counts after decades of accusations of abuse. Delano D'Souza reports.
He's one of the most recognizable voices in R&B. And now, after decades of dodging criminal responsibility for allegations of sexual misconduct, R. Kelly has been found guilty for sex trafficking. The 54-year-old's lawyer vowed to appeal and took aim at the prosecution for cherry-picking their narrative.
Mr. Kelly is disappointed. He was not anticipating this verdict because based on the evidence, why should he anticipate this verdict? When you go over to Discovery, you saw witness after witnesses giving 3, 4, 5 different versions as to what they said happened here.
While R. Kelly's legal team attempted to portray his victims as groupies and stalkers, allegations of inappropriate relationships have dogged him since the mid-90s. He illegally married late R&B singer Aaliyah when she was just 15. Despite the accusations, R. Kelly continued to sell records and concert tickets. However, the Me Too movement gave his accusers a louder voice after they previously felt ignored. Several witnesses testified during the 5.5-week trial, including one woman who said she was locked up for 2 days without food and water before being assaulted by Kelly.
Today's guilty verdict forever brands R. Kelly as a predator who used his fame and fortune to prey on the young, the vulnerable, and the voiceless for his own sexual gratification. A predator who used his inner circle to ensnare underage girls and young men and women for decades.
R. Kelly has been in jail without bail since 2019. His sentencing has been scheduled for May and he risks up to 20 years behind bars. On top of Monday's conviction in New York, Kelly also faces federal charges on child pornography in Chicago.
Our picture of the week is this one. It shows close to 500 Haitian migrants camped out on the northern border of Colombia. They're getting ready to move north through the treacherous jungles of Panama. Their goal? The United States. Well, that impromptu camp set up near the border, not far from where people enter the jungle, is now adding to Joe Biden's migration policy headaches. Meanwhile, in Ecuador, 30 inmates were killed and dozens more hurt in a prison riot. The violence involving gunfire, knives, and explosives was caused by a dispute between two prison gangs. The Latin American country has long grappled with gang violence in its overcrowded prisons, with criminal groups from Mexico, Colombia, and Brazil often battling for control inside, where they then manage drug trafficking and other illegal activities on the outside. Yuka Roye explains.
A gun battle inside the walls of a prison. Not a rare occurrence in Ecuador, whose notoriously underfunded and overcrowded detention facilities are hotbeds for gang violence. Tuesday's clash was sparked by a dispute between two prison gangs. They attacked each other with guns, knives, and explosives. It took 5 hours for the police to bring the situation under control. Criminal groups from Mexico, Colombia and Brazil have long battled for control inside Latin American prisons, which they use to orchestrate drug trafficking and other activities on the outside. In February of this year, nearly 80 inmates died in simultaneous coordinated riots in 3 prisons, including this one in the coastal city of Guayaquil. Ecuador's main port city is a major hub for shipping South American cocaine to the north. In July, President Guillermo Lasso decreed a state of emergency in Ecuador's prison system to allow soldiers and police officers to beef up security checks with an aim to curb attempts to smuggle arms, drugs and cell phones to inmates.
When it comes to deaths from COVID-19, Peru has the world's highest number compared to its population. The rising numbers have kept the country's potential tourists at bay for months now. But little by little, travelers are starting to come back. France 24's Thomas Nicolon takes a closer look at how many workers in the tourism industry are finally starting to have new hope.
Located in the Peruvian Andes, Cusco is the former capital of the Inca Empire. It's one of the most touristic cities in Peru. But for several months in 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic kept travelers at home. Those who rely on tourism were hit hard.
I wasn't prepared because I am a day laborer. When the pandemic started, we had to go on a 3-month lockdown. It was really hard because I had to try and survive with my savings.
Public health measures are being lifted little by little, and tourists are slowly starting to return. Shop owners are optimistic. but they hope that things will go back to how they were before the pandemic.
Fortunately, everything is changing now. But the tourists are mainly Peruvian, the huge majority of them. We see some foreigners too, but very few. We hope that with time everything will get better, because here we all benefit from international tourism.
Machu Picchu, located about 3 hours from Cusco, is one of the most popular sites in Latin America. This ancient Incan citadel was built in the 15th century and still captivates tourists and archaeologists.
Visiting Machu Picchu is very overwhelming. All visitors, and mainly tourists, find it interesting, especially on a cultural level.
At Machu Picchu, the capacity limit for tourists had been drastically reduced to better comply with social distancing. But these measures have gradually been lifted, even though mass visits can harm the site.
There is damage. We can see it. There is proof of that. By walking here, tourists damage the rocks.
Tourism is a vital industry to Peru. The country's GDP fell by more than 11% in 2020, and it's estimated that the pandemic has led to a drop of over 70% in tourism activity.
Well, you know, it might not be winter yet, but 2 brown bears in Alaska seem to be getting ready for their long naps in the cutest possible way. These 2 brown bear siblings, nicknamed JB and Patron, have become social media stars thanks to what's been dubbed their synchronized naps. The video was filmed by a manager at the nonprofit wildlife sanctuary that takes in orphaned and injured animals up in Portage, Alaska. Well, that wraps it up for this edition. Thanks so much for watching Inside the Americas. We'll see you again next time for all the news from north to south.
Hidden in plain sight, mountains of rubbish that have travelled far. Poland is Europe's favourite destination for disposing of waste cheaply. Giant dump sites which conveniently catch fire. An illegal trade as lucrative as narcotics, while the environment pays the price.
Down to Earth on France 24 and France24.com.